Camping with a Skinwalker. True horror stories. Welcome back to another episode of Nightmare Campfire. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into stories that'll make you think twice before pitching a tent in the wilderness. You know, there's something about being alone in nature that strips away all our modern pretenses. No cell service, no streetlights, just you and whatever else calls the darkness home. Whether you're a seasoned backpacker or someone who thinks camping means a cabin with Wi-Fi, these stories might make you reconsider your next outdoor adventure. Tonight's tales come from the deep woods, where shadows move in ways they shouldn't, and familiar voices call from empty trails. We've got stories from experienced hikers who thought they knew every danger the wilderness could throw at them, only to discover that some threats don't appear in any survival manual. These are accounts of encounters with something that defies explanation, something that watches from the tree line and learns to wear the faces of those we trust most. Got your own camping horror story? Send it my way through the contact form on our website. But for now, grab your sleeping bag, check your tent zips, and let's get started with tonight's first tale. The Week That Changed Everything, from Marcus Rivera. I need to tell someone about what happened in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains last September, and this seems like the only place where people might actually believe me. My name is Marcus, I'm 34, and I work as a software engineer in Denver. I'm telling you this up front because what I'm about to describe sounds completely insane, and I want you to know that I'm not some conspiracy theorist or someone who usually believes in paranormal stuff. I'm the guy who debugs code for a living, who needs logical explanations for everything. But after what happened during that camping trip, I don't know what to believe anymore. It started as a solo backpacking trip that was supposed to last a week. I'd been planning it for months, needing to disconnect from work stress and a messy divorce that had finally been finalized. My ex-wife Sarah had always hated my camping trips, said they were just an excuse to avoid dealing with real life. Maybe she was right. But after 6 months of lawyers and paperwork and dividing up everything we'd built together, I needed to get as far away from civilization as possible. I chose a remote area in the Sangre de Cristo range, about 40 miles from the nearest road. The kind of place where you hike for 2 days just to reach your base camp, where the trail markers disappear and you're navigating purely by topographic maps and compass readings. I'd done similar trips before, so I wasn't worried about the isolation. In fact, that was exactly what I was looking for. The hike in took me 2.5 days, and everything went according to plan. The weather was perfect, clear skies and temperatures in the 60s during the day, dropping to the 40s at night. I set up my base camp near a small alpine lake at about 11,500 feet, surrounded by peaks that stretched up toward 14,000 feet. It was the kind of place that makes you feel small in the best possible way, where the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. For the first 3 days, it was exactly what I needed. I'd wake up with the sunrise, make coffee on my camp stove, and spend the day exploring the surrounding area. I climbed a couple of unnamed peaks, found some old mining equipment left behind from the 1800s, took probably 1,000 photos of landscapes that would never look as beautiful in pictures as they did in person. At night, I'd sit by a small campfire and read by headlamp until I got tired enough to sleep. It was peaceful. Healing even. For the first time in months, I wasn't constantly checking my phone or worrying about work deadlines or thinking about the divorce. I was just present in the moment, surrounded by wilderness that had looked exactly the same for thousands of years. The first sign that something was wrong came on the 4th night. I was sitting by my campfire, reading a paperback novel, when I heard what sounded like someone calling my name from across the lake. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it was definitely my name. Marcus! Marcus! I looked up from my book and scanned the far shore, which was maybe 300 yards away. Nothing visible, just the dark outline of trees against the starlit sky. I called back, "Hello? Is someone there?" But there was no response. I figured it might be another backpacker who'd seen my campfire and was trying to get my attention. It wasn't unheard of. even in remote areas like this. Sometimes people get lost or have equipment failures, and they're looking for help. But when I called out again, offering assistance if they needed it, I got only silence. I kept listening for another hour, but I didn't hear the voice again. Eventually, I banked my fire and went to sleep, though it took me longer than usual to fall asleep. Something about the voice had seemed off, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The next morning, I decided to hike around the lake to see if there were any signs of another campsite. I found nothing. No tent sites, no fire rings, no trash, no footprints other than some old animal tracks. Whoever had been calling my name had either moved on, or I'd imagined the whole thing. That afternoon, while I was exploring a talus field about a mile from camp, I heard the voice again. This time it was closer, and it was definitely calling my name. But when I stopped and looked around, I couldn't see anyone. The voice seemed to be coming from behind a large boulder. But when I climbed over to investigate, there was nobody there. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The voice sounded exactly like Sarah, my ex-wife. Same tone, same slight accent from growing up in Texas, same way of pronouncing my name with just a hint of exasperation. But Sarah was back in Denver, probably at work in her law office, definitely not hiking around the Colorado backcountry calling my name. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, listening carefully and looking for any sign of movement. The rational part of my brain was trying to come up with explanations. Maybe I was more stressed about the divorce than I'd realized, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the altitude was affecting my judgment, even though 11,500 feet wasn't high enough to cause serious altitude sickness for someone acclimated like I was. Maybe I was just lonely, and my subconscious was filling in familiar voices to combat the isolation. But the voice had been so clear, so perfectly Sarah's voice, that it was hard to dismiss as imagination. I hiked back to camp and spent the evening trying to rationalize what I'd heard. I made myself a good dinner, wrote in my journal about the day's hike, and tried to focus on the positive aspects of the trip. But I found myself constantly scanning the tree line around my campsite, looking for movement that shouldn't be there. That night, I heard the voice again. This time, it woke me up from a sound sleep around 2 a.m. "Marcus, where are you? I'm lost. I need help." It was coming from somewhere beyond my tent, in the direction of the lake. Same voice, same perfect imitation of Sarah, but now with an edge of panic that made my heart race. I unzipped my tent and crawled out, grabbing my headlamp and turning it on to scan the area around my campsite. "Sarah?" I called out, even though I knew it couldn't really be her. "Is that you?" "Marcus, thank God. I've been looking for you for hours. I'm down by the water, but I can't see your camp. Can you come help me?" The voice was definitely coming from the direction of the lake, maybe 100 yards from my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound, but something made me stop after about 20 feet. Maybe it was the way the voice carried in the thin air, or maybe it was some primitive survival instinct. But suddenly every alarm bell in my head was going off. Why would Sarah be here? How would she have found me in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest road, without any camping gear that I could see? How would she have known where to look for me when I hadn't told anyone my exact destination? I stood there in the darkness, pointing my flashlight toward the lake, and called out again, "Sarah, if that's really you, how did you get here? Where's your gear?" The voice responded immediately, with just a hint of irritation that was so perfectly Sarah that it made my chest tighten. "Marcus, stop asking stupid questions and just come help me. I'm cold and scared, and I need you to guide me back to your camp." But something about the phrasing was wrong. Sarah had never, in 8 years of marriage, asked me to guide her anywhere. She was fiercely independent, the kind of person who would rather wander around lost for an hour than ask for directions. And she'd never once called my questions stupid, even during our worst fights. "Prove it's you," I called back. "Tell me something only Sarah would know." There was a long pause, maybe 30 seconds of complete silence. Then the voice came back, and this time it sounded different. Not angry or panicked, but almost amused. "Come find me, Marcus. I'm waiting for you by the water." The way it said my name sent chills down my spine. It was still Sarah's voice, but there was something underneath it now, something that didn't sound human. Like there were two voices speaking in unison, one mimicking Sarah, and one that belonged to something else entirely. I backed toward my tent, keeping my flashlight pointed in the direction of the voice. "I know you're not Sarah," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Whatever you are, stay away from my camp." The response was laughter. Sarah's laugh, but wrong somehow. Too long, too many notes, echoing off the water in a way that natural laughter shouldn't echo. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my tent with my back against the rear wall, flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. The voice called out a few more times, always from different directions around the lake, always perfectly mimicking Sarah but saying things she would never say. Around 4 a.m., it started mimicking other voices. My mother, calling me to come home for dinner like she had when I was a kid. My college roommate, Dave, asking if I wanted to grab a beer. My boss from work, telling me I had an important phone call. All voices I recognized perfectly. All voices that had no business being in the wilderness at 11,500 feet in the middle of the night. When the sun came up, the voices stopped. I packed my gear as quickly as possible and hiked to a different campsite about 5 miles away, hoping that whatever was mimicking those voices was tied to that particular location. The new site was in a narrow valley surrounded by steep walls, more defensible and easier to monitor for approaching threats. But I'd barely set up my tent when I heard my name being called again, this time from somewhere up on the ridge above me. Still Sarah's voice, but now it sounded like she was injured. "Marcus, help me. I fell and I think my leg is broken. Please. I can see your tent down there. I need you to come help me." I looked up toward the ridge, using my binoculars to scan for any sign of movement. Nothing. The voice was coming from a spot where the terrain was so steep that anyone with a broken leg would have fallen much farther than just the ridge. That's when I realized that whatever was doing this had followed me. It wasn't tied to the lake. It was specifically targeting me. And it was smart enough to know that I'd moved campsites and adapt its hunting strategy accordingly. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of responding to the voice, I stayed silent and used my binoculars to methodically scan every inch of the ridge where the sound was coming from. For about 20 minutes, I saw nothing. Then, just as I was about to give up, I caught a glimpse of movement behind some scrub oak about 300 feet up the slope. At first, I thought it might be an elk or a bear, just a large, dark shape moving between the trees. But as I watched, the shape stood upright and moved in a way that was almost human. Almost, but not quite. The limbs were too long, the gait was too fluid, and it moved with a predatory grace that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. I kept watching through the binoculars, and after a few minutes, the thing moved into a small clearing where I could see it more clearly. What I saw made me drop the binoculars and scramble backward into my tent. It looked like a person, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, maybe 7 feet, with arms that hung down past where its knees should be. It was wearing clothes that looked exactly like what Sarah had been wearing the last time I'd seen her. A blue hiking jacket and dark pants. But the clothes seemed to hang loose, like they were draped over a frame that was the wrong size. And its face. God, its face was Sarah's face, but stretched and distorted like someone had tried to mold her features onto a skull that was the wrong shape. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth was too wide, and when it smiled, and it was definitely smiling as it looked down toward my campsite, there were too many teeth. It waved at me with one of those two long arms, a slow, deliberate wave like it was mocking me. Then it called out again in Sarah's voice. "I can see you down there, Marcus. Why won't you come help me?" I spent the next hour watching it move around the ridge, always staying just far enough away that I couldn't see it clearly without the binoculars, but close enough that I knew it was still there. It seemed to be studying me, learning my routines, figuring out how to get closer without spooking me completely. That evening, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of setting up a campfire like I had every previous night, I stayed hidden in my tent with all my gear packed and ready to move. I wanted whatever this thing was to think I was asleep and vulnerable, while actually being prepared to run if it got too close. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling my campsite. Not the heavy, clumsy steps of a bear, or the quick, light steps of a deer, but deliberate, measured steps like someone trying to move quietly. They would take a few steps, pause for a long time, then take a few more steps from a different direction. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see a shadow moving around outside. It was tall and moved wrong, just like the thing I'd seen on the ridge. But now it was maybe 20 feet away, close enough that I could hear its breathing. The breathing was the worst part. It sounded human, but there was something else mixed in with it, a slight wheeze, like air moving through passages that weren't quite the right shape. And it was too regular, too controlled, like it was consciously thinking about each breath instead of breathing naturally. "Marcus," it whispered. And the sound was so close to my tent that it might have been right outside the fabric. "I know you're awake. Come out and talk to me." Still Sarah's voice, but now it had dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than when it had been calling from a distance. There was an intimacy to it that made my skin crawl, like it was pretending we were lovers sharing secrets in the dark. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, hoping it would think I was asleep and move on. But it knew better. "I can hear your heart beating," it whispered. "I can smell your fear. There's no point in pretending to sleep." For the next 3 hours, it circled my tent and talked to me in Sarah's voice. Sometimes it sounded like the Sarah I'd fallen in love with, reminiscing about our honeymoon or the house we'd bought together. Sometimes it sounded like the Sarah from our worst fights, accusing me of being selfish and emotionally unavailable. And sometimes it said things that Sarah would never say, things that revealed knowledge about me that it shouldn't have had. It knew about the recurring nightmare I'd had as a child, about being chased through dark woods by something I could never see clearly. It knew about the scar on my back from when I'd fallen off my bike at age 7, a scar that was hidden under my shirt, and that even Sarah had rarely seen. It knew about the time in college when I'd cheated on an exam and never told anyone, a secret I'd carried for over a decade. How could it know these things? How could it know details about my life that even my ex-wife didn't know? "You've always been running from something, Marcus," it whispered around 3 a.m. "Even as a child, you knew there were things in the dark that wanted to catch you. You never stopped running, did you? That's why Sarah left you. That's why you're out here alone. You're still that scared little boy, running through the woods." That hit too close to home. My throat tightened, and I felt tears starting to form, which made me angry. This thing, whatever it was trying to get inside my head, trying to break me down emotionally so I'd be easier to manipulate. "You're not Sarah," I said through gritted teeth, "and you don't know anything about me." It laughed, and this time the sound was definitely not human. It started as Sarah's laugh, but devolved into something else. Something with too many voices layered together. "I know everything about you, Marcus. I've been watching you for days, learning your scent, your voice, your fears. I know how you move when you think you're alone. I know how you talk to yourself when you're scared. I know exactly what you need to hear to make you come outside." The footsteps moved away from my tent, circling wider around my campsite. Then the voice changed, becoming my mother's voice from when I was 8 years old. "Marcus, honey, come inside. It's time for dinner, and your father's getting angry that you're not listening." The voice was so perfectly my mother's that for a moment I was 8 years old again, standing in the backyard of our house in suburban Denver. knowing I was in trouble for staying outside too long. The emotional response was automatic and overwhelming, 30 years of conditioning that made me want to obey without thinking. I actually had my hand on the tent zipper before I caught myself. "Clever," I whispered. But my mother never called me honey. The voice switched tactics, becoming my father's stern tone from when I was in high school. "Marcus, get out here right now. We need to have a talk about your behavior, and I'm not going to ask twice." That one was harder to resist. Even as an adult, that particular tone from my father could make me feel like a teenager who'd been caught sneaking out. But my father had been dead for 5 years, and this thing was wearing his voice like a costume. For the rest of the night, it cycled through voices from my past. Teachers, friends, relatives, even voices I hadn't heard in years but recognized immediately. Each voice perfectly mimicked, each one designed to trigger specific emotional responses that might make me lower my guard. But it made one crucial mistake. Around 5 a.m., it started using the voice of my college friend Jake, trying to convince me to come outside for a beer and a chat about old times. The problem was, Jake had never called me by my full name. To him, I'd always been Mark, or Rivera. When the thing called me Marcus in Jake's voice, I knew for certain that it was just mimicking sounds without understanding the relationships behind them. That gave me some comfort. It might be able to perfectly replicate voices, but it didn't truly understand human connections. It was working from recordings, not relationships. When the sun came up, the voices stopped, and the footsteps moved away. I waited another hour before unzipping my tent to look outside. There were tracks in the soft earth around my campsite, but they weren't quite human footprints. They were longer and narrower, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. I packed my gear and started hiking out immediately. I'd planned to stay for 3 more days, but there was no way I was spending another night anywhere near that thing. As I hiked, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it following me through the trees. But I saw nothing unusual, just normal wilderness and the occasional deer or squirrel. The hike out took me 2 days, and both nights I barely slept. I'd find a defensible spot to camp, somewhere with clear sightlines in all directions, and I'd stay awake most of the night listening for footsteps or familiar voices calling my name. But the thing seemed to have given up the chase, or maybe it was tied to that particular area and couldn't follow me too far. When I finally reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, just enjoying the feeling of being surrounded by metal and glass instead of thin tent fabric. I drove straight home to Denver without stopping, and I spent the next week researching everything I could find about the area where I'd been camping. What I found disturbed me more than I'd expected. There had been disappearances in that region going back over a century. Not many, maybe one every few years, but enough to form a pattern. Experienced hikers who'd gone into the wilderness alone and never come back out. Their gear would sometimes be found weeks later, scattered across miles of terrain. But the hikers themselves were never found. The local rangers and search and rescue teams had theories about bear attacks, falls into hidden crevasses, sudden weather changes that could disorient even experienced backpackers. All reasonable explanations for the standard dangers of wilderness travel. But I also found references in old newspapers and local history books to Native American legends about creatures that lived in the high mountains and could mimic human voices to lure people away from safety. The specific details varied between tribes, but the core story was consistent. Something lived in the remote peaks that could wear the faces and voices of loved ones. Something that hunted humans by exploiting our trust and emotional connections. The Ute tribes had specific warnings about traveling alone in certain areas, particularly during the times of year when the boundaries between the human world and the spirit world were thinnest. They had rituals and protections for anyone who had to venture into those dangerous territories, ways to ward off the creatures that hunted by mimicry and deception. Reading those old stories, I realized how lucky I'd been. The thing that had stalked me for 2 nights had been patient, trying to wear down my defenses gradually instead of attacking directly. If I'd been less paranoid, If I'd trusted one of those familiar voices just enough to step outside my tent in the darkness, I might have become another unexplained disappearance in the Colorado wilderness. I haven't been camping alone since then. I still love the outdoors, but now I stick to established campgrounds with other people around, places where the silence isn't complete and the darkness doesn't feel quite so absolute. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep in my own bed back in Denver, I hear Sarah's voice calling my name from somewhere far away. But I know better than to answer. The Hunting Party, from Jennifer Walsh. This happened when I was working as a wilderness therapy guide in northern Montana, near Glacier National Park. It was part of my job to take groups of troubled teenagers into the backcountry for week-long expeditions designed to build confidence and teach life skills. Tough job, but rewarding when you could see kids who'd been written off by everyone else discover that they were stronger and more capable than they'd ever imagined. The group I want to tell you about consisted of 6 teenagers, ages 14 to 17, who'd been referred by various social services agencies and alternative schools. They'd all been in trouble for different reasons: drugs, theft, fighting, truancy, but they shared a common thread of feeling disconnected from their families and communities. My job was to help them reconnect with themselves and each other through the challenges of wilderness survival. We'd been out for 4 days, and everything was going better than expected. The kids were working together, following instructions, and starting to open up about their problems instead of just acting out. We'd hiked about 30 miles into a remote area of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, far enough from civilization that we wouldn't see other people for the duration of our trip. Our group consisted of me as the lead guide, my assistant Jake, who was a 25-year-old former Marine with experience in wilderness therapy, and the 6 kids: Ashley, Marcus, Devin, Samantha, Tyler, and Jordan. Ashley was 17 and had been in and out of group homes since she was 12. Marcus was 16 and had serious anger management issues stemming from an abusive home situation. Devin was 15 and had been caught dealing drugs at his high school. Samantha was 14 and struggled with self-harm and depression. Tyler was 17 and had been arrested multiple times for theft and vandalism. Jordan was 16 and had basically stopped going to school or coming home for months at a time. Not exactly an easy group to manage under normal circumstances, but in the wilderness, away from all their usual triggers and distractions, they were actually starting to bond and look out for each other. It was the kind of breakthrough that made all the difficult days worthwhile. On the 4th night, we made camp in a beautiful meadow surrounded by dense forest, with a clear stream running through the middle and peaks visible in all directions. Perfect campsite for a group our size, with plenty of space to spread out, but still stay within the boundaries we'd established for safety. Jake and I had our own tent, positioned where we could keep an eye on the kids' tents while still giving them some privacy. The kids were paired up in 3 two-person tents, arranged in a rough circle around the fire pit we'd built in the center of the campsite. Everything was normal until about 2 a.m., when Ashley woke me up by shaking my tent. "Miss Walsh," she whispered urgently, "something's wrong with Samantha. She got up about an hour ago and walked into the woods, and she hasn't come back." I was awake immediately. One of our absolute rules was that nobody left the campsite after dark without permission and without a guide. It was a safety issue, but also a discipline issue. Part of the program was learning to follow instructions and think about consequences before acting. I woke Jake, and we both got dressed quickly. Ashley led us to the tent she'd been sharing with Samantha, which was indeed empty. Samantha's sleeping bag was unzipped and her boots were gone, but her jacket was still hanging inside the tent. "Did she say anything before she left?" I asked Ashley. "Was she having a nightmare, or did she seem upset about something?" Ashley shook her head. She was sleeping fine. Then around 1 a.m., she sat up really fast, like someone had called her name. She listened for a minute, then she put on her boots and walked out. I asked her where she was going, but she didn't answer me. She acted like she didn't even hear me. Jake and I exchanged glances. Samantha had been doing really well on the trip, engaging with the group activities and seeming more confident each day. It would be completely out of character for her to wander off alone, especially at night when she was usually afraid of everything. We woke up the other kids and explained the situation. Nobody else had heard anything unusual, but Marcus mentioned that he'd gotten up to urinate around midnight and thought he'd heard someone talking in the distance. It sounded like a conversation, he said, like two people having a quiet discussion somewhere in the trees. I figured it was you guys talking about tomorrow's plans or something. Jake and I definitely hadn't been talking. We'd both been asleep until Ashley woke us up. We organized a search, giving each of the remaining kids a flashlight and pairing them up so nobody would be alone. Jake took Tyler and Jordan to search the eastern edge of the meadow, while I took Ashley and Devin to search the western edge. Marcus stayed at camp to keep the fire going and watch for Samantha in case she came back on her own. The search lasted 3 hours and covered a roughly half-mile radius around our campsite. We called Samantha's name constantly, and we found some footprints leading away from camp toward a dense grove of pine trees, but the tracks disappeared on rocky ground, and we couldn't pick up the trail again. What bothered me most was how far the footprints were spaced apart. They looked like Samantha's boots, the right size and tread pattern, but the stride length was longer than what a 14-year-old girl should be able to manage. It looked like she'd been running or being carried, but there were no other footprints nearby to suggest someone had been with her. By dawn, we still hadn't found any trace of Samantha beyond those initial footprints. Jake and I made the decision to hike out and get help from the park rangers. We packed up camp and started the 2-day hike back to the nearest ranger station, hoping that Samantha would somehow find her way back to the trail or that we'd encounter other hikers who might have seen her. The kids were shaken by Samantha's disappearance, but they handled the emergency better than I'd expected. They helped break camp efficiently, stayed together during the hike out, and didn't complain about the forced march pace we had to maintain to reach help as quickly as possible. But on the first night of our hike out, something happened that made me realize Samantha's disappearance might not have been a simple case of a confused teenager wandering off in the dark. We'd made camp in a small clearing about 10 miles from where Samantha had gone missing. I was exhausted from the stress and the long day of hiking, but I was having trouble falling asleep. Every sound in the forest made me think it might be Samantha trying to find her way back to us. Around midnight, I heard voices coming from the direction we'd come from. Multiple voices, having what sounded like a conversation in low tones that carried clearly in the still night air. At first I was relieved. Maybe it was a search and rescue team that had been dispatched to look for Samantha, or maybe it was other hikers who'd found her and were bringing her back to safety. I unzipped my tent and listened more carefully. The voices were definitely getting closer, but something about them seemed wrong. They were too evenly spaced, like people taking turns speaking in a formal pattern, rather than having a natural conversation. And the tones were all similar, like the same person doing different voices, rather than multiple people talking. I woke Jake and pointed in the direction of the voices. He listened for a moment, then grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside the tent. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there? We're looking for a missing member of our group." The voices stopped immediately. Complete silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then we heard Samantha's voice, clear and unmistakable, calling back from the darkness. "Jake! Miss Walsh! I'm here! I got lost, but I can see your camp now. I'm coming toward you." Jake and I both felt a wave of relief. Samantha was alive and apparently uninjured, and she'd managed to find us despite being lost in the wilderness for over 24 hours. But then Ashley sat up in her tent and said something that made my blood run cold. "That's not Samantha," she said quietly. "Samantha never calls you Jake. She always calls you Mr. Rodriguez." Ashley was right. In 4 days of camping, Samantha had never used Jake's first name. She was shy and formal with adults, especially male authority figures, and she always used titles and last names even when we encouraged the kids to be more casual. "Miss Walsh, can you hear me?" Samantha's voice called again from the darkness. "I'm hurt and I need help. Can you come find me?" The voice was perfectly Samantha's, Same slight lisp from her retainer, same nervous way of speaking when she was asking for help. But now that Ashley had pointed out the inconsistency, I could hear other things that were wrong with it. Samantha never called me Miss Walsh. To her, I was always Jennifer or Jen, because I'd specifically told all the kids that they could use my first name to help break down the barriers between us and them. And Samantha would never admit to being hurt or ask for help so directly. She was the kind of kid who would suffer in silence rather than admit weakness, who would downplay injuries because she'd learned not to trust adults to take care of her properly. "That's not Samantha," I whispered to Jake. "Something's using her voice." Jake nodded grimly and reached for the bear spray we kept clipped to his belt. "Kids," he called quietly to the tents around us. "Everyone stay in your tents and don't come out no matter what you hear. Something's not right here." "Miss Walsh?" Samantha's voice called again, closer now. "Why aren't you answering me? I can see you're tense. Are you mad at me for getting lost?" The voice was maybe 50 yards away, just at the edge of our flashlight range. Jake swept his beam across the tree line, but we couldn't see anything moving. Then Tyler spoke up from his tent. "Guys, that's definitely not Samantha. Listen to how she's breathing." He was right. Between the words, we could hear breathing that was too loud, too deliberate, like something that was thinking about each breath instead of breathing naturally. "I'm coming to your camp now," the voice announced. "Don't be scared. It's really me." That's when we saw it. At the very edge of Jake's flashlight beam, something tall and thin stepped out from behind a tree. It was wearing Samantha's clothes, the same purple hoodie and jeans she'd been wearing when she disappeared. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too angular, moving with a fluid grace that didn't match Samantha's usual awkward teenage movements. In the dim light, we could see that its face was Samantha's face, but stretched and distorted like a photograph that had been edited badly. The features were in the right places, but the spacing was wrong. The proportions off just enough to trigger that uncanny valley response that made you know you were looking at something that wasn't quite human. "See?" it said in Samantha's voice. "I told you it was me. I just got a little lost, but I'm okay now." It started walking toward our camp with that same unnatural, too smooth gait. No stumbling over rocks or ducking under branches, just a steady approach that suggested it could see perfectly in the darkness. Jake stepped forward, putting himself between the thing and the kids' tents. "Stop right there," he said firmly. "You're not Samantha. What are you? And what did you do with her?" The thing stopped walking, but tilted its head to one side, studying Jake with an expression that was almost curious. When it smiled, we could see that its teeth were wrong. Too many of them, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth, but somehow crammed into a human-sized jaw. "What did I do with who?" it asked in Samantha's voice. But now there was something else underneath the familiar tone, something that sounded amused by our fear. "I'm right here. Can't you see me?" Devin started crying in his tent, and Tyler was whispering what sounded like prayers. Ashley had gone completely silent, but I could hear her rapid breathing from inside her tent. Jake raised the bear spray, though I wasn't sure how effective it would be against something that wasn't actually a bear. "Last warning," he said. "Stay back." The thing that looked like Samantha laughed, and the sound was wrong in every possible way. It started as Samantha's laugh, but it kept going too long, getting higher and more distorted until it sounded like multiple voices laughing in harmony. "You can't hurt me with that," it said. "But I appreciate the effort. It shows you care about the real Samantha. Don't worry, she's safe. She's with the others now." "What others?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "The ones who came before her. The ones who answered when I called their names." The thing gestured vaguely toward the darkness behind it. "They're all here, waiting. Would you like to see them?" That's when we heard other voices calling from the forest. Familiar voices, all perfectly mimicked, all wrong in subtle ways that made our skin crawl. Jennifer, come help us. We're hurt. That was my mother's voice, though my mother lived in Portland and had never been camping in her life. Jake, we need you, man. We're in trouble. That sounded like Jake's army buddy Carlos, who'd been killed by an IED in Afghanistan 3 years earlier. Ashley, honey, come to Mama. Ashley's mother's voice, though Ashley's mother had been dead from a drug overdose since Ashley was 12. Each voice was perfectly reproduced, down to accents and speech patterns and emotional inflections. But they were all calling from the darkness beyond our campsite, and they all wanted us to leave the safety of our lights and our group. How do you know these voices? Jake demanded. How do you know about people who are dead? The Samantha thing tilted its head again, considering the question like it was genuinely curious about our reaction. I learn by listening, it said. I've been listening to all of you for days, learning your voices, your fears, your connections to others. You think very loudly when you sleep. Your dreams are full of voices from your past. It stepped closer, and in the better light, we could see more details that were wrong. Its skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like a mannequin made of cheap plastic. Its eyes were Samantha's eyes, but they didn't blink often enough. And when they did blink, the eyelids moved too slowly. The girl was easy, it continued. She heard her mother calling and followed the voice without question. Children are trusting that way. But you adults are more suspicious. You require more convincing. The voices from the forest got louder and more insistent. Now there were dozens of them, all calling our names, all claiming to need help or offering help. I heard my father's voice, though he'd been dead for 8 years. I heard my college roommate Jenny, my high school boyfriend Matt, my grandmother who'd raised me after my parents divorced. All voices I hadn't heard in years, all reproduced so perfectly that my heart ached with recognition, even as my rational mind knew they couldn't be real. Stop it, I said, surprised by how firm my voice sounded. These people are dead. You're just playing recordings. Am I? The thing smiled wider, showing more of those wrong teeth. Or am I giving you exactly what you've always wanted, a chance to hear those voices again, to say the things you never got to say when they were alive? That hit harder than I'd expected. There were conversations I'd wanted to have with my father before he died, apologies I'd wanted to make, questions I'd wanted to ask. The voices in the forest seemed to know this, because now my father's voice was calling specifically to me. Jenny, sweetheart, I'm sorry we fought before I died. I want to make things right between us. Come talk to me. My eyes filled with tears before I could stop them. My father and I had argued the last time I'd seen him, a stupid fight about my decision to work in wilderness therapy instead of getting what he called a real job. He died of a heart attack 2 weeks later, and I'd never had the chance to apologize or tell him that I loved him despite our disagreements. Jennifer, don't listen to it, Jake said urgently. That's not your father. It's trying to manipulate you. I knew he was right, but the emotional pull was overwhelming. The voice was so perfectly my father's, carrying that slight Boston accent he'd never quite lost despite 40 years in Montana. It even had his habit of calling me sweetheart when he was trying to make peace after an argument. I know you're angry with me, my father's voice continued from the darkness. I know I wasn't always the best dad, but I love you, sweetheart, and I'm proud of what you've become. Come talk to me. Let me tell you all the things I should have said when I was alive. I actually took a step toward the forest before Jake grabbed my arm. That's not him, he said firmly. And even if it was, would your father really want you to abandon these kids and walk into danger? Would he ask you to choose between him and your responsibility to protect them? That snapped me back to reality. My father, whatever his faults, had been a man who believed deeply in protecting children and honoring commitments. He would never ask me to abandon my charges to satisfy my own emotional needs. You're right, I said, wiping my eyes. My father would tell me to take care of the kids first. The Samantha thing's expression shifted, becoming less amused and more frustrated. "You're stronger than most," it said, "but everyone breaks eventually. I have all night." For the next 4 hours, it tried different approaches. Sometimes it would send the fake Samantha closer to our camp, limping and crying, begging us to help her with injuries that looked horrifyingly real. Sometimes it would use the voices of the kids' family members, calling to them from the forest with promises of love and forgiveness and second chances. Devon's father, who'd beaten him regularly before child services removed him from the home, called out apologies and promises to change. Tyler's grandmother, who'd been the only stable adult in his life before she died when he was 14, offered him the comfort and guidance he'd been desperately missing. Each voice was perfectly crafted to exploit specific emotional vulnerabilities, and I could see the kids struggling not to respond. They wanted to believe that their dead loved ones had somehow found them in the wilderness, that they were being offered a chance to heal old wounds and say goodbye properly. But they also trusted Jake and me enough to follow our instructions to stay in their tents no matter what they heard. Around 4 a.m., the thing tried a different strategy. Instead of calling to us from the forest, it sent multiple figures into our campsite. They looked like people we knew, all wearing the right clothes and moving with familiar gaits, but all wrong in the same subtle ways as the fake Samantha. I saw my mother, my father, my ex-boyfriend from college. Jake saw his dead army buddies, his grandmother, his high school coach. The kids saw family members, friends, teachers, a parade of familiar faces that should have been comforting but instead filled us with horror. They didn't speak this time. They just stood at the edge of our firelight, smiling those too wide smiles with too many teeth, waiting for one of us to break and approach them. "Nobody move," Jake whispered. "Don't look directly at them. Don't respond to anything they do." But it was almost impossible not to look. The figures were so familiar, so perfectly crafted to pull at our heartstrings. Ashley was staring at what looked like her dead mother, tears streaming down her face, but her body frozen in place by fear and confusion. Marcus was looking at a figure that I assumed was his father, the man who'd abused him for years before Marcus was removed from the home. But this version of his father looked kind and gentle, holding out his arms like he wanted to give Marcus the hug he'd never received as a child. The emotional manipulation was sophisticated and cruel, designed to exploit each person's specific traumas and unfulfilled needs. But it was also generic in a way that revealed the thing's limitations. It could mimic appearances and voices perfectly, but it didn't understand the complex emotions behind human relationships. The fake version of Marcus's father was offering physical affection, but Marcus had never wanted hugs from his abuser. He'd wanted protection, justice, an acknowledgement that what had happened to him was wrong. The thing was offering comfort, but what Marcus needed was validation. Similarly, the fake version of Ashley's mother was smiling and holding out her arms, but Ashley's relationship with her mother had been complicated by addiction and neglect. Ashley didn't want a warm reunion. She wanted answers about why her mother had chosen drugs over her daughter. "These aren't the people you remember," I said quietly to the kids. "They're just masks. The real people you're seeing. They loved you despite their flaws, and they wouldn't want you to be hurt. They wouldn't ask you to leave safety to chase an illusion." The figures began to move closer, but something about our lack of response seemed to frustrate whatever was controlling them. Their movements became more erratic, less human. The fake smiles became grimaces, and we could see that their eyes were all wrong. Black pits that reflected our firelight like an animal's eyes. "You can't keep them here forever," the Samantha thing said. "Eventually they'll have to sleep or eat or make mistakes, and when they do, I'll be waiting." But as the sky began to lighten with dawn, the figures started to fade, becoming translucent, and then disappearing entirely. The voices from the forest grew fainter, and finally stopped altogether. The Samantha thing was the last to go, standing at the edge of our campsite as the sun came up. "This isn't over," it said in Samantha's voice. "I know where you're going. I know the path you'll take to get back to safety. I'll be waiting for you along the way." Then it too faded away, leaving us alone in our campsite with the morning sun and the normal sounds of the forest waking up. We packed up immediately and started hiking out, but we didn't take the direct route back to the ranger station. Instead, Jake led us on a longer, more difficult path that avoided the areas where we'd been planning to camp. It added an extra day to our hike, but none of us wanted to risk encountering that thing again. The kids were quiet during the hike out, processing what they'd experienced, but they'd proven to themselves that they could face something terrifying and not break, that they could trust adults to protect them and trust themselves to make good decisions under pressure. When we finally reached the ranger station and reported Samantha's disappearance, a search and rescue team was organized immediately. They searched for 5 days, covering a radius of over 20 miles from where she'd last been seen. They never found any trace of her. The official report listed her as a missing person, presumed dead due to exposure or animal attack. Her family held a memorial service, and the Wilderness Therapy Program implemented new safety protocols to prevent similar incidents. But I knew the truth about what had happened to Samantha, and I knew that the thing that had taken her was still out there, still learning, still perfecting its ability to mimic human voices and faces. 6 months later, I quit wilderness therapy and moved to a desk job in the city. I couldn't handle being responsible for other people's children when I knew there were things in the remote places that no amount of training or experience could prepare you for. Sometimes I still hear Samantha's voice calling my name, usually late at night when I'm alone in my apartment. But I know better than to answer. I know that some voices should never be trusted, no matter how familiar they sound. And I know that somewhere in the wilderness of northern Montana, something is still wearing her face and practicing her voice, waiting for the next group of people to wander too far from safety. The Night Shift Ranger, from David Martinez. I spent 15 years as a park ranger in various locations across the Southwest before what happened at Mesa Verde made me transfer to a desk job in the regional office. I'm telling this story now because I'm retiring next month, and I think people who visit our national parks deserve to know that there are some areas where the official trail maps don't show all the dangers you might encounter. Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado is famous for its ancient cliff dwellings built by the ancestral Puebloan people over 700 years ago. It's a beautiful place, full of history and mystery, and it attracts over 500,000 visitors each year. Most people come during the day to take guided tours of the ruins, snap some photos, and learn about the indigenous cultures that once thrived in the area. But I worked the night shift, and Mesa Verde is a very different place after the tourists go home, and the shadows start to lengthen across the ancient ruins. My job was to patrol the park after hours, checking for vandalism, illegal camping, people who might have gotten lost or injured during day visits and needed assistance. It was usually quiet work. Most visitors followed the rules and left before sunset, and the few problems I encountered were typically minor. Teenagers trying to sneak in after hours to party, photographers who wanted to capture the ruins under starlight, the occasional lost hiker who'd wandered off the designated trails. But during my 3rd year at Mesa Verde, I started noticing things that didn't fit the pattern of normal park violations. It began with reports from day shift rangers about visitors who claimed to have heard voices coming from the ruins. Not other tourists, but voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify, often accompanied by sounds like drumming or chanting. The visitors would ask the rangers about special events or historical reenactments, but there were never any such programs scheduled. The rangers would investigate these reports, but they never found anything unusual. No hidden speakers, no unauthorized persons in the ruins, no equipment that could have been producing the sounds. The official explanation was that the acoustics of the cliff dwellings could sometimes amplify and distort natural sounds like wind or bird calls, making them seem like human voices. That explanation satisfied most people, but it didn't explain why the voices always seemed to be speaking in what linguists who studied the reports described as potentially archaic forms of indigenous languages. It also didn't explain why the voices always stopped the moment rangers arrived to investigate. The first time I personally encountered something unusual was during a routine patrol in late October, about 2 months after I'd started hearing these secondhand reports. I was checking the balcony house area around 11 p.m. when I heard what sounded like a conversation coming from inside the ruins. Balcony House is one of the most well-preserved cliff dwellings in the park, a complex of about 40 rooms built into a natural alcove in the cliff face. During the day, it's accessed by climbing ladders and crawling through narrow tunnels, but at night it's supposed to be completely empty and inaccessible to the public. The voices I heard were quiet, like people having a normal conversation, but they carried clearly in the still night air. I couldn't make out specific words, but the rhythm and intonation definitely sounded like human speech rather than natural sounds. I radioed for backup and approached the ruins carefully, using my flashlight to scan for any signs of unauthorized access. The ladders that provide daytime access were secured and showed no signs of being climbed recently. The area around the base of the cliff showed no footprints or disturbed vegetation, but the voices continued, seeming to come from deep within the ruins themselves. I called out the standard warnings about the park being closed and trespassing being a federal offense. The voices stopped immediately, but I didn't hear any sounds of people moving around or trying to leave the area. When my backup arrived 20 minutes later, we conducted a thorough search of the entire Balcony House complex. We found nothing. No people, no equipment, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The ruins were exactly as they should have been, empty and undisturbed. We wrote it up as a possible case of acoustic illusion and continued the patrol, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd missed something important. Over the next few months, similar incidents became more frequent. Always voices coming from ruins that should have been empty. Always stopping the moment rangers arrived to investigate. Always leaving no physical evidence of human presence. The voices weren't always speaking in unidentifiable languages either. Sometimes visitors would report hearing English, but with a strange, archaic quality that made it difficult to understand. Park linguists who studied audio recordings captured by visitors described it as potentially Elizabethan or colonial-era English, the kind of speech patterns you might expect from European settlers in the 1600s or 1700s. But Mesa Verde had never been a site of European settlement. The Spanish had passed through the area in the 1760s, but they'd never established permanent settlements in the cliff dwellings. The ruins had been abandoned by their original inhabitants around 1300 AD, and had remained largely empty until American archaeologists began studying them in the late 1800s. The historical record showed no period when English-speaking people would have lived in the ruins long enough to leave behind some kind of acoustic imprint or collective memory. Yet the voices continued, becoming bolder and more frequent as winter approached. By December, I was responding to reports of voices in the ruins almost every night I worked. The incident that changed everything happened on December 21st, the winter solstice. I was patrolling the Cliff Palace area around midnight, when I saw lights moving inside the largest of the ruins. Cliff Palace is the most famous structure in Mesa Verde, a massive complex of over 150 rooms that once housed hundreds of people. It's the crown jewel of the park, featured in all the promotional materials and visited by almost every tourist who comes to Mesa Verde. It's also supposed to be completely dark and empty after sunset. But as I approached the overlook that provides the best view of the ruins, I could see what looked like firelight flickering inside the ancient rooms. Not electric lights or flashlights, but the warm, dancing glow of actual flames. I radioed for backup immediately, and then used my binoculars to get a better look at what was happening inside the ruins. What I saw defied every rational explanation I could think of. There were people moving around inside Cliff Palace. Lots of people, maybe 50 or 60 individuals, going about what looked like normal daily activities. I could see figures tending fires, preparing food, children running between the rooms, adults engaged in conversation. They were dressed in what appeared to be traditional ancestral Puebloan clothing, simple tunics and robes, feathered ornaments, jewelry that caught the firelight. Their movements were natural and unhurried, like people going about their normal evening routines in their own homes. But Cliff Palace had been abandoned for over 700 years. There was no legal way for anyone to be inside the ruins after hours, and certainly no way for dozens of people to have entered the complex without being detected by park security. I watched through the binoculars for about 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The people in the ruins seemed completely unaware of my presence. They went about their activities with the casual familiarity of people who belong there, people who had every right to be in those rooms. When my backup arrived, I handed them the binoculars and asked them to describe what they saw. "I don't see anything," Ranger Williams said after a long moment. "The ruins look empty to me." "Are you sure you saw lights in there?" I took the binoculars back and looked again. The fires were still burning. The people were still moving around. Children were still playing in the ancient courtyards. But Williams couldn't see any of it. "There," I said, pointing to a particularly bright fire in what archaeologists called the Great Kiva. "Look right there. There's a group of people around that fire." Williams looked where I was pointing and shook his head. "Dave, I'm not seeing anything. Just empty ruins." That's when I realized that whatever I was seeing, it wasn't visible to everyone. Either I was having some kind of hallucination, or I was witnessing something that existed on a different level of reality than the physical world my fellow ranger was observing. I continued watching through the binoculars, while Williams used the radio to call for additional backup and a supervisor. The scene in the ruins continued for another hour, with the ancient inhabitants of Cliff Palace going about their evening activities as if they were still living in their own time period. Around 2 a.m., the fires began to die down, and the people started to disappear, not walking away or hiding in the shadows, but literally fading from view, like ghosts becoming transparent. Within 15 minutes, the ruins were dark and empty again, exactly as they should have been. The investigation that followed lasted 3 days and involved park officials, FBI agents specializing in federal land crimes, and archaeologists from the University of Colorado. They found no evidence that anyone had been inside Cliff Palace recently. No footprints, no disturbance of the carefully preserved artifacts, no residue from fires or other activities. The medical evaluation I was required to undergo found no signs of drug use, mental illness, or neurological problems that might cause hallucinations. My vision and hearing were perfect, my psychological evaluation was normal, and my blood work came back clean. The official conclusion was that I had experienced a form of environmental psychosis brought on by stress, isolation, and the suggestive atmosphere of working alone at night in an ancient, supposedly haunted location. I was recommended for counseling and temporarily reassigned to day shifts. But the counseling didn't help because I knew what I'd seen was real. And during my remaining time on day shifts, I started hearing stories from other night shift rangers at different parks who'd had similar experiences. A ranger at Canyon de Chelly reported seeing ancient Navajo ceremonies taking place in ruins that had been empty for centuries. A ranger at Chaco Culture Historical Park described hearing complex chanting and drumming coming from the great houses during new moon nights. A ranger at Bandelier National Monument had photographed what appeared to be cooking fires in ancient cave dwellings, though the photographs came out completely black when developed. All of these rangers were experienced professionals with clean records and no history of mental health issues. All of them had been subjected to official investigations that found no evidence to support their claims, and all of them had been quietly transferred to different positions after their reports became too frequent to ignore. I realized that what I'd experienced at Mesa Verde wasn't unique. There were locations throughout the Southwest where the boundaries between past and present seemed to be thinner than normal, where the indigenous peoples who had once lived there had left behind more than just ruins and artifacts. 6 months after the Cliff Palace incident, I requested a transfer to the regional office in Denver. I told my supervisors that I wanted to advance my career by moving into administrative work, but the truth was that I couldn't handle the night shifts anymore. Not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I'd started to understand that what I was witnessing was sacred. The people I'd seen in Cliff Palace weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were the spiritual essence of the ancestral inhabitants, still connected to the places where they'd lived and died and buried their ancestors. I was an intruder in their sacred space, a representative of the government that had claimed ownership of their ancestral lands and turned their homes into tourist attractions. My presence during their spiritual activities was a violation of something profound and important. I spent my remaining years with the Park Service working on policy development and visitor education programs. I pushed for more respectful interpretation of Indigenous history, more consultation with tribal representatives, and better protection of sacred sites within park boundaries. But I never worked another night shift, and I never returned to Mesa Verde after dark. Sometimes, when I'm driving through Colorado and I see the road signs pointing toward Mesa Verde, I think about those fires burning in the ancient ruins and the people who tend them. I wonder if they're still there, still going about their daily lives in the place they never really left. And I wonder how many other places in our national parks are home to presences that most of us can't see, spirits that continue to inhabit the landscapes they loved in life. The park brochures don't mention any of this, of course. Visitors come to see the archaeological remains and learn about the mysterious disappearance of the ancestral Puebloan people. But they didn't disappear. They're still there, just existing in a way that most of us aren't equipped to perceive. If you ever visit Mesa Verde, treat it with the respect you'd show to any place where people have lived and died and left their stories written in stone. Remember that you're walking through someone's ancestral home, not just an outdoor museum. And if you happen to see lights in the ruins after dark, or hear voices speaking in languages you don't recognize, maybe just appreciate the privilege of witnessing something sacred and leave them in peace. Some places belong to the past, and some experiences are meant for the people who have the right to be there. Those stories stay with you, don't they? There's something about the wilderness that strips away our modern certainties and reminds us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. Whether it's something that mimics the voices of our loved ones, something that wears familiar faces to lure us away from safety, or something that exists in the spaces between what we think we know and what's actually out there in the darkness. The thing that connects all of tonight's stories is the idea that the natural world isn't just empty space waiting for us to fill it with our adventures and Instagram photos. It's inhabited by presences that have their own agendas, their own territories, their own ways of dealing with intruders. Marcus learned that some things in the high country know how to use our emotional connections against us, that the voices of people we love can become weapons in the wrong hands. Jennifer discovered that experienced guides and troubled teenagers alike can be vulnerable to predators that hunt by exploiting our deepest needs for connection and forgiveness. And David found out that some places hold on to their original inhabitants in ways that challenge everything we think we know about life and death. The wilderness is beautiful, healing, transformative, but it's not safe, and it's not empty. When you venture into the remote places where cell phones don't work, and rescue is days away, you're entering territories that belong to things older and stranger than anything in our modern world. So if you're planning any camping trips after hearing this, remember a few things. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Don't answer voices calling from the darkness, especially if they sound like people who shouldn't be there. Stay together, stay alert, and respect the fact that you're a guest in someone else's home. And if you encounter something that defies explanation, something that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the natural world, don't try to rationalize it away. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is acknowledge that there are mysteries bigger than your understanding and walk away with your humility intact. Thanks for joining me around the Nightmare Campfire tonight. I'm your host, and I'll be back next week with more stories that prove the scariest predators aren't always the ones you can see coming. Sweet dreams. And remember, sometimes the best camping trip is the one where you make it home with all the same people you started with. Until next time, keep your tents zipped, your flashlights closed, and your voices quiet after dark. You never know what might be listening.